Welcome to the Startup Field Guide, where we learn from successful founders of unicorn startups how their companies truly found product market fit. I'm your host, Sandhya Hegde, and today with my co-host, Wei, we'll be diving into the story of Gretel. Started in 2020, Gretel is a synthetic data platform for developers. Gretel makes it really easy to generate artificial data sets with the same characteristics as real data, which often has things like sensitive customer information in it. So with Gretel, you can actually test AI models without compromising any data privacy. Over 75,000 developers use Gretel Cloud already, and today we have with us the CEO and co-founder of the company, Ali Gulshan. Ali, welcome to the Field Guide.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Good to see you again, Wei.
Good to see you, Ali.
Yeah, you two have met once before, right?
Yes.
I was going to say, we've been in the trenches together and we've built a lot together, but we've actually never done a podcast.
That is true.
Excited to chat with you.
And here to help.
Usually when it came to the choice of who do you want to have on, everybody picked Wei. So that's why I never ended up on any of the podcasts.
They didn't have to worry about editing him quite as much, huh?
Yeah, very polished.
Ali, you actually started your career way back when in US intelligence, right? What was that like, and how has that informed your approach to being a startup founder?
For me, that was a very much accidental path. When I was in university, I was studying computer science and math. I had some mischievous times and I was expelled from university. And this is before it was cool to be expelled or get kicked out of university or leave school. And it had to do with a lot of sort of what I would consider to be white hat hacking at the time. Naturally, that skill set was very interesting for the intelligence community. So I was recruited by the intelligence community. I went into the US intelligence community and focused on a lot of things around signals intelligence, reverse engineering, analytics, things like that. That was a somewhat of an indirect, unplanned path into the U.S. intelligence community, but it was phenomenal because I got to work with some of the most amazingly talented people in the world. They had some of the sort of brightest minds, especially sort of bleeding edge technologies at the time. My two co-founders, Alex and John, that I work with right now at Gretel, both came out of the NSA. So just phenomenal people in that whole industry.
And Ali, Gretel is your third startup now. You started with Cyfort. You founded StackRox, and then now there's Gretel. And I remember the first time we chatted about Gretel, you were so excited about it. Love to ask, what made you feel so compelled to do another company, to do a third company, and to go after this idea in particular?
Sure. So there was a lot of reasons to it. Originally, when we started working on it with Alex and John, we had known each other for decade plus, and this is still 4 or 5 years back. And we were always very eager to find something to work together on. So Gretel actually sort of started as an evening and weekend hackathon. Let's find an open source project and tool to work together on. And it actually initially started when we were looking at some devices in our homes just for fun and found out how much data they were moving out. And we're like, well, the world is going to become more and more edge-based. They're going to be more and more data. How do we just build something privacy tooling? So the concept really started from a standpoint of let's do something together around privacy because it's just something we're passionate about. Then it got to a point where, so Alex Watson, one of my co-founders, he had sold his company to AWS. He was a GM there. And he had sort of, after 4 years, he's like, fuck this, I'm out. There's only so much AWS you can take. And I'm assuming, Wei, you can attest to that. So he decided to come and actually do it full time. And John left shortly after that with him. And part of the thesis there was that this application of privacy, and very early on, they were sort of orienting around differential privacy, Alex and John, was it could be enormously valuable for this emergence of AI. And this is 2018, 2019, before it was super buzzy. I started putting in a little bit more time into it because you could probably remember, Wei, we were at StackRox. It was a pretty fucking miserable time at that point for us. It was very exhausting and we were just feeling a little burnt out with everything we were doing. Quite transparently, you're a founder, you're in it, but it wasn't very fun. You're just I just got to keep pulling this thing along. Gretel almost became this like side project hobby that I worked on with Alex and John. We founded it together, but then they became involved full time actually building the company while Wei and I were still at StackRox. And that's sort of how it all came about. And then obviously after, about a year and a half, when Red Hat ended up acquiring us at StackRox, that's when I ended up leaving and joining Alex and John full time at Gretel.
I love this authenticity around the privacy space that you have. Ali, I think a lot of people don't necessarily realize that Gretel sort of references that, like, the idea of like there's sort of digital breadcrumbs, that you're trying to, you leave a trail, you're trying to sniff it out, like, protect against it.
It's Hansel and Gretel.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
love it. Love it.
The whole thought process was that if you leave a single bit of digital breadcrumb, it will forever be remembered by you. So that's sort of where we came up. It's like it has to be dealt with from the root. You basically have to leave no footprints for privacy to really work.
And I remember, like, when you first were starting out, you were really driving like a lot of thought leadership around this space of privacy engineering and this serving developers and giving them this toolkit to enable, helping them to solve privacy problems. And I'm curious, like, we always think about the why now behind a new idea and a new company. Like, for you guys, the three of you, like, what was the why now behind, why privacy engineering? Like, why was it time to, build a product, that developers needed to solve those problems?
The main reason for it was a few different problems. One, the three of us had always dealt with the cold start problem of data. Like, we even saw this at StackRox. Like, hey, we want to build a cluster of tools. We want to test it. There's no data. Customers can't share their data. It's all sensitive. So part of it was this really bottleneck of getting access to data and the cold start problem. And people who typically suffer most from that are the developers. Like, eventually that sort of makes it downstream and somebody in marketing or sales or ops or finance uses a tool and they have to deal with the same problem. But at the ground, the person who's building it still has to test it somehow. And that was sort of a very fundamental problem that we were trying to solve. The privacy part of it was always the driver for it because we sort of viewed ourselves very similar, like corollary to how Apple talks about their products. Like, you buy it for the user experience or polish or capabilities, but privacy is at the core. So when we released it, our view was that actually privacy engineering as a service, where you just have a bunch of APIs and it makes your data easy, safe, and sort of private to work with, is the right way to orient. And that was actually one early assumption that turned out really not to be sort of a fit for our product and our users. The privacy messaging really in the early days tended to orient us a lot more towards like privacy engineers, security engineers, compliance teams. And it kept shifting the conversation to like CISO, CIO, CSO, people who quite frankly have like no idea what the ML stack looks like. Like, what does it mean for a model to memorize data? But the thing we were always very adamant about is, and this is based on a lot of, as founders do, they have biases and we have all of our historic sort of context and experiences. So we really did want to focus on the developer because we felt like they're the ones who are sort of suffering the most. And we remember seeing this report from Kaggle that talked about roughly a third of every project is dedicated to just getting access to data, normalizing it and making it usable. And that was sort of what we wanted to remove as a chunk, because if you could remove that, then building other vertical use cases or sort of getting it a little bit more scaled was easier. So we started with that, but very quickly, we found we didn't really want to be classified with like traditional security privacy companies. And then what we also found was the more pull in the market for us was more around the utility and the accuracy of the output of our models versus the privacy. That privacy was like, okay, it's great that it's private. We want that, but how good is the accuracy and the utility? So it became a little bit of this pull where in Asia and Europe, actually privacy was pulling us, but in North America, it was more utility and accuracy. And at the same time, we start to see a lot of the emergence of the generative AI technologies and sort of buzz. And because that became sort of a tailwind, we ended up essentially orienting even down to our messaging around what we would consider to be the synthetic data. So we sort of said privacy first, synthetic is how we do it, and we just raised that synthetic piece to the top. And the part of it that Alex and John actually had the foresight, I had really nothing to do with this, like a lot of things at StackRox that, Wei and I got credit for, but it was basically Wei doing it. Gretel actually started in 2019 using language models to build synthetic data, because our assumption was language models actually carry much better insights from the sort of the data itself. So there was a lot of the pieces there, but the orientation ended up changing because like most industries, positioning and messaging sort of almost dictates your funnel process.
Right. And I would love to build on that a little. If you could break it down in terms of timing, like, you obviously you're cheating a little. You're thinking about Gretel while you're supposed to be building Stack Rocks. We won't tell anybody. But like, what was the process of like taking that kernel of the idea and actually finding what we like to call like the first few desperate customers, like figuring out where you have pull. What were some of the activities you focused on, and how long did it take you to arrive at like the use case is synthetic data for testing AI models, and this is the person who will climb hills to get access to our beta product?
Yeah. So the original, call it open source project, really started in end of 2019. Sort of summer of 2019 was when me, Alex, and John started sort of putting together some very loosely put together open source packages. And the thinking there was, can we use deep learning models with differential privacy to build synthetically generated data? That was actually the first piece that we started. Then towards early 2020, so in February of 2020, Gretel raised a $3.5 million seed round from Greylock. It was Sridhar Ramasamy who ended up investing in the company. And it was actually very much an alignment of thesis. So Sridhar was the SVP of engineering and ads for Google for about 10 years. And one of this sort of thesis was that I had like dozens and dozens of engineers who did this for me. So there was an API that did this for me. It would be very valuable to the industry. So one of the things, and again, this is when I was still at StackRox, what Alex and John did is they very quickly sort of productized that API. So it was behind some consumable UI. They released an early access 6 months later, and just basically got a few hundred developers on the platform to start getting some traction and feedback. And part of it was one of the early sort of assumptions we made was, if you're using synthetic data, you really don't need things like data labeling, programmatic labeling. Synthetic data comes out perfectly labeled, perfectly balanced. You don't need sort of all these additional tools. So we wanted to validate that just because it made a huge difference as to where we would fit in into the ML ops workflow, and sort of the types of companies we would, potentially be complementary to, partner with, versus would be sort of a duplicate of. And when we released that, there was a couple of early discoveries. One was we very quickly realized, because there were already synthetic data companies in the market and synthetic data was a known sort of entity as a concept, the association or the misperception of synthetic data was really this notion of like fake data. Oh, you need QA testing, you need volumes of testing, you can use synthetic data. But like, if you really want to test things, use your raw data, properly labeled data, it has the most amount of value. And we realized that, so like, not only is the market early, there's like early, and we have to entirely change the perception of what synthetic data built with language models for AI actually means. Then the other part of it was, very early on, we were collaborating with Google on privacy. And one of the things we realized was the implementation of privacy at the right time of model training makes a huge difference. To overly simplify it is, most companies take differential privacy, they train a model, they bolt it on top, they generate some sort of noise, and that basically creates differentially private data. Our team realized very early on you can train models with differential privacy, and the difference there is whether the model is shareable itself or not. If the model is shareable, you can expose that model, and essentially the eventual view was like you can commercialize that model from its data, basically. And then the third assumption that we wanted to validate and learn from is, we had a couple of pieces in our product. One we called classification, and the other one was transformers. Transformers, not GPT transformers. Transformers in the sense of tokenization, encryption, anonymization as a precursor to privacy synthetics itself. So we wanted to have sort of this industrial grade bulletproof privacy. And what we wanted to see was whether users and developers wanted to use these tools independently, essentially like have building blocks or Lego blocks, or they wanted to have end-to-end workflows. And what we found out, sort of this was contrary to our original thesis, was developers like the notion of building blocks once they get very sophisticated and scaled, because they can call each one of those blocks through an API and build their own automation. But from like step 0 to 7, they just want very prescriptive, opinionated workflows. So when we released this alpha in September of 2020, we had all those 3 big learnings. We took all of that, put it back into the product. Luckily, we were very transparent with Sridhar. He actually really loved that stuff. He ended up preempting our Series A right when we shared all these learnings with him. We thought he would be like, what the fuck? You told me this stuff works. And he's like, great learnings. Let's double down. So kudos to him and helping us. And that's really when we took a lot of that, started building it going forward. And it was early to sort of mid 2021 that we actually ended up rolling out the GA of all these particular products. And that's roughly when I ended up joining as well.
Got it. And do you remember whether there was like a specific industry or, like fintech? Like you would assume that given, the value prop around privacy,
Yeah.
that there are specific industries that are maybe early adopters. But I'm curious what you actually observed in terms of who were the first few people to, be evangelists for Gretel.
It's interesting you say that. Recently, I've had some conversations with some investors, and one of the questions I always ask them is like, where do you see synthetic? Like, they always reach out and they're like, oh, we would love to talk to you. We have this thesis. I'm like, tell us about your thesis. It's like, synthetic data is great. I'm like, cool. Okay. But I always ask them about use cases, and they're like regulated industries. And I feel like that's actually quite a lazy answer. And the reason is that regulated industries like health, finance, government, there is an amount of inbound that you get from them. But the regulated industries need to meet a minimum privacy bar or safety bar for some access to the data. Now, whether that data is balanced, biased, underrepresented, improperly distributed, enough data in itself is actually all unanswered questions. So regulation is a very, very low bar because for that data to truly have valuable output, you need a lot more prep to do with it. Like whether you boost it, balance it. In some cases, what we even do when we talk about accuracy of data, we consider ourselves in the data business, not synthetic data business. So some of our customers who have more advanced use cases, the target they set with us is we want to improve our downstream prediction or inference over 100%. And what that means is their raw data produces 100% as part of their baseline. And what they do with us is they take a bunch of these underrepresented data sets or demographics, they create more synthetic versions of them and augment their raw data with synthetic data so they have a much more balanced, sort of perfected data set. So these were some of the things that I think became, in our opinion, more horizontal use cases. We still do maybe 10, 15% of our total pipeline generation through outbound lead generation because it makes sense. We tend to focus overwhelming majority of it as what we call like qualified inbound. And as part of that, we do see regulated industries play a part in it. But as we're starting to see sort of the first patterns of maturity, we're finding that just being a regulated industry is actually just purely the bottom of the totem pole, which is like, I just want to share my data. What I do with it needs a lot more sophistication and sort of higher bars.
Got it. So like outside in now, what are the characteristics you look for to say, oh my God, that should be a good customer for us?
Well, one thing that's, I think, helpful with every industry, and I think like Wei and I experienced this firsthand at StackRox when we made sort of our, like when I remember on a weekend, on a Friday, one of our board members like, Wei, we need a new product strategy that works. And was like, all right, I got to come back on Monday with Kubernetes. But for those who don't know, like basically Wei spent a weekend to come up with a new StackRox strategy.
Wait, that is not how you described it when you did this interview.
That is the true version. I think he probably like presented it much more humble than that. But Wei was basically given a weekend to save the company. So what I mean by that is that when we ended up bidding on Kubernetes about 2-3 years into the company, the tailwind was very clear. It just like massive lift right away. And the reason I mentioned that is that similarly sort of things happened at Gretel, which is like once the sort of the lift of large language models, generative AI, all this stuff started to hit, it just created an enormous amount of tailwind for us. So really the inflection point was, I need to use data. I need to access data. I have an enormous bottleneck or friction. And now the bet is around a bunch of things that naturally give you a second or third or fourth chance within a customer to be able to use you, even if something doesn't work perfectly. And that sort of helped accelerate a lot of things for us.
Ali, you think there was any like lessons learned, in terms of like at StackRox? I mean, even early on, a lot of people were like, container security, it's only for, financial services and for, people who have like heightened security requirements. Like people didn't really realize that like Kubernetes was going to become as pervasive and widely adopted as it has been, right? Like, I'm curious, like in the context of AI, obviously it opens up so many use cases for a product like Gretel. Like, how much did you anticipate that? I mean, be honest. Like, I know
Yeah.
you were working with models, but like, did you really anticipate kind of the wave we've seen around, Chat GPT and like Stable Diffusion and like AI more broadly? Like, I mean, and how it's captured like people's imaginations.
Yeah. So I'm glad your question about learnings from StackRox to here was about product, not generally in people, because I was about to unload. So, I think in the context of product, there were a few things we did anticipate. Um, and then there were a few that just completely ended up being accidental. So maybe talking about things that we actually anticipated. And if you go back to like our seed deck, we always talked about this was, our premise was always that the right privacy and safety can accelerate access to data. And our thesis was with the emergence of AI, edge computing, all these pushes, people are going to need more data. You can't prevent them from not getting or collecting data. So you need a way to basically like reduce the economics of data acquisition. And we wanted to figure out a way to solve for that. Now, we didn't anticipate like large language models specifically to be just like 99% dominant in that big category. We thought it would be a bunch of things that would sort of push to that, which is also why we started with the privacy engineering messaging around our tooling, because we weren't just focused on large language models. But then the things that ended up sort of creating a more and more tailwind was where we won quite a bit on a single differentiation was the accuracy and the utility of our output. So people were like, I want to start looking more and more into using synthetic data for machine learning or for AI. As a result, even 5 to 10% of accuracy difference is a world of difference for us. So I would argue the thing that for us became opportunistic, not foresight, was what we call the last mile problem, which is now one of the biggest use cases that drives us, which is the thesis that we developed last year as we saw some of these language models evolving was when you have language models, like right now, the economics of them are essentially you're just powering and paying cloud providers to use GPUs to a certain degree, and they're the ones who are making money. At some point, you have to take these foundation models and economically make them viable. They become platforms, they become verticalized use cases. And the way to do that is you can't find that data in the public domain. So that tuning, fine tuning, optimization, if you want to make Chat GPT, your company GPT for chat, you have to train it on your data. But how do you make sure you're not loading all your sensitive data, model memorizing, all the things with rights to be forgotten? So all the privacy implications, all the way to a path of what if someday, and this was actually within our vision of, how do we allow companies to monetize or commercialize their data? So if you're a massive financial institution and your data is valuable for you to train your models, but you also want to commercialize it safely for others to train on your data, that was a big problem we wanted to solve. So our view was that, okay, well, training on private domain data is actually the key to commercializing a lot of these foundation models that are being built and sort of taking them that last mile. So I would say our sort of thesis around the general data bottleneck held to be true. The more practical applied version of it, what does it look like day to day? That LLM training, especially on private data and doing it safely, became more of an accelerant last year. And I think one of the very key things for us that was half true was our assumption about our user and buyer. So we started, as you all pointed out, with the developer-centric view, and we still view ourselves to be the developer-centric platform. And part of it is we wanted to build around cloud-native technologies. We didn't want to build professional services. So all of this meant we would be able to build a particular product. But for you to extend that into your platform, you needed at least bare minimum programming capabilities. So you can write a few scripts or a few calls and be able to integrate it into APIs and other types of platforms. But what we learned over the last year commercializing is while the technical champion and decision maker is the developer, they may actually never be the buyer, and the buyer may never ever touch our product. So that 75,000 users that we have on our platform that are building models and sort of teaching us about how to auto-configure and auto-tune models, not a single one of them may be a buyer, and they may never actually see that platform. And originally, we had built a lot of our funnel from top of the funnel, sort of customer acquisition all the way down, in this orientation that we have to find a developer. But about 6 to 9 months ago, we found that actually, if we break this out and say PQL is for the product qualified user who could be the technical champion, MQL and sales qualified rated user is actually somebody who's a buyer, and we don't build one common denominator for both of these, we can actually be much more proficient. So it was sort of learnings like that were contrary to our original thinking. That sort of we have to make changes. And a lot of it sort of goes back to what you were saying, Sandy, is like it feels like every week there's a new pattern that you have to adjust to. So I think the key things are some of our original concepts around developer wanting to build with this type of technology, synthetic data with differential privacy and language models have held true. One of the headaches I'm glad to have avoided at Gretel compared to StackRox is like we didn't have to make that like product pivot. But from a messaging, user, ICP positioning, these have all been like completely new learnings. And this is something like I wish I had remembered like or knew at my first companies is like when we hired our first VP of sales at Gretel here, the person we hired, a guy named Jeremy, like I remind him all the time, like you're not a VP of sales, like you're like a business officer. You're literally trying to figure out how to commercialize something in an industry that has never existed before. So I think it's very important to bring those. And our assumption again was some things you could do in parallel, but what we realized is like you have to build the product, then you have to build some messaging, then you have to try pricing, then you have to reiterate. Like it was a lot of serial processes because in a nascent market, like you figure out a base because if you have multiple verticals dependent on each other and one holds not to be true, like everything is wiped. So it was a little bit more systematic, which was
Right.
probably a slower progression into the market for us. But luckily, it has turned to be a relatively fast uptake.
Right.
Yeah, I mean,
And I'm curious, you did say that like, obviously your original thesis has only gotten stronger with, what has happened in terms of just how much interest there is in the,
Mhm.
entire business ecosystem to try to leverage the data they have and, leverage LLMs in particular, but all kinds of foundation models. But I'm curious, there must still have been some big bets that you needed to place once you saw what was happening. So if you kind of go back to like
Yeah.
maybe 9 months or a year ago, what were some of the big unknowns for you as you saw, the Stable Diffusion launch, the ChatGPT launch? Like,
Yeah.
what were the big questions that maybe you now have better answers for, but at the time were tough decisions to make?
So one thing that we ended up accelerating because of Stability AI's work and OpenAI's work was from day one, and we have blogs about this. We sort of one of our major bets also in synthetics was synthetic data has to mirror real practical use cases of data. So the platform for synthetic data has to be multimodal. Not just a single modality. And the thesis actually was very similar learnings we had in security, like build one platform if you can, rather than like vertical tools for every new functionality that comes up. So with that, we started with tabular data and time series data. And we had built an internal framework called Model Integration Framework. This is actually one of our sort of core differentiators. It enables us to tune and build our own models substantially faster than a lot of other players. When Dolly came out and when ChatGPT came out, we realized that we actually have to pull that front and we have to invest a lot more in the different modalities that we have. So that was something that certainly happened as an accelerant. We weren't planning on releasing some of the modalities as fast as we did. And some of them ran into early friction. Some of them we had to build sort of in an unnatural way just to find even if the sort of the user matched our core user. We tend to not think about like modalities all in equal. We think about it like based on our core users, based on our use cases, which ones have compounding value. And that's how we determine the directionality, not like image is hot, let's go do image. So that was one that certainly changed around our roadmap a little bit, but that was just the normal pull we were seeing from customers. The other part of it was the same framework we had built actually did something that we never anticipated would be valuable for anybody other than us, but now it's one of the biggest pulls, which is something very similar to what Mosaic does. So we had built this framework we call Gretel GPT. And Gretel GPT is actually not just a Gretel generative pre-trained transformer. It's actually a framework that you can plug in any open source GPT into, and it will bolt on a bunch of our own unique capabilities, differentially private training, tuning, gradient clipping, validation modeling, reporting, text measurements for accuracy, all these sort of like enterprise grade tools that we wanted for our own GPT. And very quickly became apparent that as if you sort of rewind to your point, 9 months ago, maybe most LLM bake-offs were won by OpenAI. Now there's a dozen different options and that number is reducing. So as that trend was starting to build, we were just getting same asks and asks. Can we just plug in another model in your GPT, use all this framework, run it in our own environment, apply all these privacy tools, so you can not only be a model, but also a safe framework for fine-tuning, training, or experimenting with LLMs. So we're seeing a lot of traction on that. If you look at our customer deck, it's one of the big use cases that never anticipated to be the one. But again, like this sort of goes credit to my co-founders, Alex and John. They had the foresight to build this for us, and now it's becoming a very valuable framework. So yeah, I think there's a lot of things we've opportunistically jumped on and sort of have had this tailwind to go with. But I think any founder will tell you in an early market, you'll take any sort of unfair advantage you can get to sort of land yourself in a customer.
Ali, I'm just curious, like from a practical perspective, a lot of what you're describing requires, really quick adaptation, to learnings that you're gaining, what's happening in the market. I mean, with AI, things are moving so quickly from week to week. How do you, Alex and John, operate in a way that, allows you to, really change things quickly and decisively? I would say, we often think like the most successful are, one of the things that's common to them is kind of the slope or rate of change
Yeah.
that they're able to drive, And so, I would say at StackRox, it was the opposite. Like we had our assumptions and we were not adaptive enough early on, at least. And then we had to pull it back from the brink. But, at Gretel, like how did the three of you work together to move quickly, in a sensible and rational way?
I mean, what you're touching on, I actually think like the early years of StackRox really shaped my thinking about the early days of Gretel. At the same time, if you remember, Alex came 4 years out of AWS. He was a GM there. He launched 3 of their fastest growing services. That sort of all brought us to this fact that we always knew that much more sophisticated, large scale, advanced customers will, especially because of privacy, will never want to use Gretel Cloud and use us as a SaaS service. But what we always figured is if we leave a X amount of credits every month in perpetuity, we will build up a user base there. So we actually use our cloud to not only sort of enable individual users to be able to build it into their reference frameworks, validate all the claims we're making very openly, make it very transparent. But the biggest value we get from it is we actually introduce all of our new features in Gretel Cloud first, see how they work, sort of expose them to that 75,000 users, get iterations, workflows, what breaks, all these sorts of things. And then we take that and we build it into our hybrid model that deploys in customers' own environments and in own clouds and sort of like can scale. So one area for us has really been to use that as a tip of the spear for experimentation and loading everything much faster. And while we do have some enterprise customers, it is really a little bit more of an early preview landscape for us, but it gives us much faster velocity, much faster iteration, experimentation. We even take some subset of our most advanced users, give them early preview of products. So that has been very helpful. The other one that I can say 100% has been shaped by my experiences is like, as you said, Wei, right? Like there's sometimes no good option. It's just like 2 bad options because you really don't know and you just have to make some tough choices. And I think the 3 of us are just very comfortable making difficult choices. And it partially comes down to the team. This is really a topic that I don't think is talked about enough, which is that I think the board dynamics with founders has a lot to do with how quickly you make decisions, because I think founders in a lot of times like feel compelled, like I have to double down, like we have to make this work. I mean, you may remember this. Like I remember we had a board member like 9 months after we had launched was like, you got to give this thing time to work. And you and I were like, we know this doesn't work. Like we got to change. And I think here, a lot of the boards sort of top down was like, we're supportive. We bet on you guys because we think you know what you're doing. We had this sort of massive amounts of input data. And then we got very particular about the type of people we hired. Like, some of the folks that came from StackRox, like people who just wanted to innovate. And it was sort of combination of make tough decisions, have an environment when you can get very fast iterative feedback. So not everybody's like debating philosophically, is this right? Is that wrong? We can throw something out and in 2 weeks, a few thousand people can use it. And then the third one is I think like myself, John, and Alex as founders have really good complementary skills. Similarly, like to how you and I operated at StackRox. So I think it's just a bunch of different things that has given us this velocity. That is actually something we had an all hands today board meeting last week. I do say that like our product velocity and releases is something I'm very proud of. Like the team has done an incredible job sort of creating high velocity releases there.
I'm taking away a very nuanced lesson here as a board member, which is don't make founders sell products they don't like. That's
As long as the founders are somewhat selling to the people who are kind of like them. But if like if you have a founder selling to someone that is not at all like them and saying they don't like this, then you're probably right to put your foot down. But yeah, I think like how the board interacts with founders has a lot to do with the speed, because I think, I don't know, like you call something a pivot and it has such a negative connotation, but like we don't call it a pivot, but we make hundreds of minor adjustments from month to month. Like we constantly tell the whole company, like this is the North Star, we're going to zigzag our way there. And as long as we're just generally sort of trending the right way, that's the most important part. So we try to sort of shorten those life cycles as much as possible. And I think it really helps that, like, especially John and Alex coming from that disciplined background of like AWSs of the world, like very quick iterations, customer voice. Like, I'll give you one example. One of the things we ended up doing was to make the voice of the customer even more announced in the R&D org was based on a lot of the learnings, which I'm sure is an entire deep dive in the AI space in itself. We actually ended up eliminating all function of SE and CX in sales. We literally removed it all. And we built a team called R&D facing customers in R&D, which is actually a couple of extra folks we hired with applied science and engineering backgrounds that report to engineering managers and applied scientists, but they're purely working with our customers for fine-tuning models, optimization, large-scale deployments, integrations into cloud-native frameworks. And once we realize that they're talking to their peers as PMs, they're deeply technical, they're not translating something with missing words, and that very quickly makes it back into the product and we can push it through things. So it's sort of all those little optimizations that I think have helped, essentially, again, having top-down support, but being tough on decisions. Like we've made some decisions that is like, I'm happy to use an example with a customer if you want, where we're like, we're going to basically shut this off and let the product speak for itself if it's going to work.
You brought up kind of, enterprise, right? And one of the things we're seeing is that right now, at least when it comes to like traditional enterprise businesses, maybe not, large software companies, there's a lot of desire to figure out, how do we leverage this? Let's not get left behind. But there's very little in-house talent in terms of actually figuring out even how to deploy a tool like Gradle, leave alone kind of, recreate it in-house. So what are you seeing as kind of the, biggest enablers? So you have kind of an old school enterprise company that maybe has a lot of data, but, has never like actually deployed ML in production. What do you see as kind of the stepping stones and the drivers of like true enterprise adoption here?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think to talk about what's the biggest enabler, like we should talk about what is our biggest friction point. And our biggest friction point is really operationalizing in an automated way. And part of this, again, like sort of back to StackRock's learnings is that in a very technical space that is very nascent, like operationalizing these tools is very difficult. So we learned roughly about a year and a half ago that operationalizing Gradle was not really about deploying Gradle. Gradle's, a few containers or a bunch of APIs, or you run it in cloud. What is the most friction is the data that has to come to us and where we have to send that synthetic data out of. So we actually ended up allocating a good portion of our product roadmap every release to what we call downstream, upstream connectors, like one button connect, S3, BigQuery, getting that data into us. One button deployment on top of Kubernetes so you can deploy. Making sure all of our UI functionality is replicated in API. So if somebody's running in Vertex or SageMaker or Azure ML, they don't have to run Gradle UI. They don't even have, they can transact through the marketplace and plug it in and just run normally. So I would say the biggest enabler was sort of recognizing and admitting that sometimes it's not your product, but you just have to do things that are in your ecosystem to help your own product. And we ended up spending a lot of investment and cycles in doing things that helped our product operationalize. And once we sort of took one step further and operationalized that, we would go further and further. But we would make those very modular, because what we don't want is to say, here's an opinionated end-to-end workflow and here's how you have to run it. So it's sort of that decision of core product is very much product roadmap, core product. All these integrations are either through ecosystem partners, source available, or even open source connectors, things like that that just sort of help. But I would say it's the sort of the two sides of the same coin.
Got it. And I'm curious, like the questions you get from more traditional customers, are they do you find yourself as a company educating them a lot on the ecosystem, and like where is the lift heaviest in terms of education that is, maybe adjacent to what you actually do as a company?
Yeah. I'm laughing because like there was an early incident where we were talking to this customer, and as founders, as we all know, we're only humans, and I just like lost my cool. It's like, okay, well, we're clearly not for you because you don't get this, and let's all move on and be happier about this. This was a couple of years back. Maybe I shouldn't be saying that, but it's true. We were like, that's just not right here. I think some of the more traditional questions we get are not necessarily because a company is traditional, but it's because we're talking to an org that is more traditional thinking in their approach to something. This could be a very large financial company, like audit company or a tech company. But if we come across for some reason, like their security team or privacy team or compliance team, and they're used to, I run my tools in air-gapped environments. This never leaves. I run SQL in my, database on-prem, and this is how you access it. I need a reverse proxy. It's more that type of thinking that for us causes the most amount of friction, which is sort of one of the reasons why we've oriented our ICP around the developer and a cloud native stack, because that's actually a qualify out for us. Oh, you want us to plug into Oracle 8 in your, private data center? Well, you're probably best using one of the other synthetic data companies that do that. So I would say it's more traditional workflows, but we've intentionally stayed away from those because traditional workflows also don't have that sort of large overlap of sort of consistent and normalized integration points of APIs or RPCs and things like that, which is, I think, what gets you into the trouble of like, we need professional services, managed services, like forward deployed scientists. We wanted to always avoid that. So for those traditional workflows, we very willingly like concede those and walk away from those because we're trying to build a little bit more of an efficient asymmetric motion for go to market.
I mean, Ali, like we always think about sort of the urgency that a prospect has, and I think what you're describing is like if there's not alignment between like the problem that they're actually looking to solve, like you can't convince them, like it just doesn't necessarily make sense. Times, I mean, maybe eventually they'll get there, but I think if they don't appreciate what your product's able to do, kind of here and now, then you're not in a good position to make them be successful with them.
Yeah, and you're actually hitting on something very important there, Wei, because like the way we sell is actually very different than like how OpenAI sells. Like I do think there's this sort of these waves to the whole generative AI space, which is I do think most companies are thinking about it as like, what is our LLM strategy? Like, how are we going to use it? Which ones we're going to use? How are we going to tune them? Do we fine tune, optimize, prompt tune? Do we do it in our own environment? Do we do it in the cloud? There's all these questions that they're having to answer, which in a way can create artificial pressure points for your sales team to like fear sell them. Like this company, your competitor is betting on these two LLMs. They're going to offer X amount of less, services or more sort of things like that. For us and synthetic data, there are some companies that recognize the privacy implication, but for us, it's still very much like a value sell. What can we do with it? What is the outcome accuracy? What are the things that you can do with synthetic data that we couldn't do? Let us run it for 2 months and measure the access difference from timing for developer versus original. So some of the things that we still struggle with but are working through is how do we get those sales cycles for more large, sophisticated, sort of high potential customers from that 6 to 9 month cycle, less to 3 months, so we can get much better forecasting. Like we make forecasts, but they're sort of educated guesses as to which quarter they fall into right now. Like we always tout about like we don't have closed loss, closed no decisions, but that doesn't help when you have a hard time forecasting. So I think for synthetics, we're still at the part of the curve where it's value sell, promissory sell, like companies that are very advanced, like some of our customers like Illumina, Snowflake, Google, like they're forward leaning, they have advanced use cases. They're like, we know exactly what to do this. But for, I would say 75, 80% of our customers, like we believe in the thesis of synthetic data, show us how it works in practice. And I think we need another like 6 to 9 months before we start to sort of hit that tip, which is like, we know we need it. We have a standard 4-week POC cycle. We're going to validate X things. And to partially to accelerate that, we're building all these frameworks. Like, here's how we measure, here's how we actually like tune all these sorts of things transparently. But some of it, unfortunately, just is market maturity that needs to happen, and some of the cycles before us to sort of get fully flushed out.
Part of what you're describing is just with any such huge platform shift, it becomes like an organizational part of organizational strategy, and what do we do about it? And you have a bunch of folks who are trying to think through like, well, this is our approach, and it takes time for that to settle a bit.
Yeah,
exactly.
But you can hopefully, pursue the holy grail of being able to write your own RFP. Like that's an, you made
We've
the
gotten
category.
exceedingly proficient at that.
Well, Ali, what would be your advice to, early stage founders, especially first time founders getting started in AI in 2023?
Talked away. I think
Ali and Sandhya.
No, I mean, in all honesty, like what I found makes life a lot easier is like working with very, very proficient product people, and like Way worked out really great as a co-founder for me at StackRock. So I just tried to replicate that. But I think the main advice is, I think, around two things. One, the general generative AI space is figuring out like what you're releasing, where it fits into this cycle, right? And I think if you're starting with like an LLM today, and even if you have a highly specialized orientation, like we're going to train it on healthcare data and healthcare tests and exams and all these sorts of things, I think it's very important to realize like where in the overall cycle you're going to hit. Is that going to be more valuable, or is it more likely that companies like P&G and Johnson & Johnson are going to use Gretel and Mosaic and, well, Databricks now, and just fine tune some existing LLM. And by the time you get yours out, there's 5 other ones, and you're basically pushed into this commoditization piece. And we, by the way, fully believe models will be fully commoditized. This is where we think data will be differentiated. This is our view that synthetic data can actually let your differentiated or unique data drive value. So figuring out that curve is very important, not only because of like consolidation and value, but also what is your motion for selling going to be? Like if you release at the peak of hype, people are pulling you. If you're doing it as building is happening, you're basically having to sort of demonstrate value. And if you're on that sort of cliff falling, you're basically in this sort of like race to the bottom for margins, which is not very valuable, and it's consolidation that is happening, which I really truly believe like labeling, that's where it's headed. Like I think every company that is doing labeling will have to pivot into something else because labeling is getting commoditized. The other advice I would generally give to founders is, I think most founders sort of have this romanticized view of what it's like to start a company. Like, yes, like there will be friction with board, there will be ups and downs with product, and I think everybody knows this. But the one thing I always remind, and dislike of our ops team and talent team, I spent like 5 minutes of every interview trying to convince someone not to join us. And part of it is, I think the biggest thing that founders sort of miss is it's the real extreme highs and lows of the business after the first couple of years. Like the first couple of years as a technical founder is amazing. Your head's down, you're building, everything's like greenfield and promissory, and here's what we're going to look like as an IPO. And it's that day that you open it up, you try to commercialize, sell it, price it, support it, product feedback, cross-functionally work, that like Monday, you're like, we're going to fail. Tuesday, you're like, oh, we won this big account. We're going to be a public company. Wednesday, your big company goes away. Like, oh, shit. So what I have found is it's these extreme highs and lows and their frequency, and that just takes this massive toll on you. It's not like work-life balance. It's just this, like you wake up 3 a.m. and it's that anxiety is still there. As much as I hate to like, quote Zuckerberg, like he was talking about, like being a founder is like waking up every morning getting like punched in the gut. Like it kind of feels like that because nobody reaches out to you with the good stuff. Like that is all stuff they share in face to face. It's like 7 a.m, Slack, all the stuff that's on fire is first to read, So I think that's the 2 words of wisdom I would say I would leave with founders.
Right. Like only start a company for something you're willing to go through that for.
Yeah.
Or because you just cannot imagine working for someone anymore. Which...
Yes. Yes. Or there's all incentives, right? Or like you believe this thing is economically so valuable that you're willing to put yourself through whatever it takes because you just want to make that money. But whatever it is, the motivation has to match that extreme scenario you deal with.
Awesome. Well, I'm glad you are doing okay without Wei. I was a little worried, but thank you
He
so
still
much
gets a lot of calls from me.
And when he still texts me for moral support.
And product.
If you get a Friday ultimatum again, I'm glad I'm glad we did this. We now know who you'll call. But thank you so much for coming on the Field Guide, Ali. I'm really excited about your new product launches, and thank you so much for sharing this story. It's going to be so useful to our listeners.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks for having me. Thanks, Brad.
You've been listening to the Startup Field Guide with Sandhya, an Unusual Ventures podcast. Stay connected with us by subscribing to the show in your favorite podcast player. If you liked what you heard, please rate our show and help us reach more aspiring founders with lessons on how to find product market fit. Thanks for listening. Until next time.